Thanks for that introduction, Dan. I do feel a little self-conscious now. I feel like my title is much shorter than the other titles, and I feel a little insecure about that. But it's great to be back here. Appreciate the invitation. Also, spoiler alert, no. Answer's no. So if you wanted to skip out after you ate lunch, you're pretty good to go. Yeah. Anyway, no, it's great to be back here. I'm going to just jump right in. My memory from the Beck tradition was that more or less people kind of felt free to interrupt. And in this particular case, that's sort of, I think that's fine. So I'm happy to take questions as we go. But I will go ahead and get started. I was going to get started. Wow. Really? Seriously? So for those of you who weren't here, I'm accustomed to using my own laptop, but in virtue of not having the right adapter, and I've got to learn the mechanics of this beast from. I think this was also around this computer was when Beck was founded 20 years ago. Is that right? Yeah. So UCLA funding is about what I remember. So I have been interested in this question up here for the last decade or so. When I was here at UCLA, I was interested in things related to social categorization, race, and cooperation, and so on. And then over the course of my career, I sort of switched gears. And I'm interested, and so the question here, I just want to be careful. So I had a couple of meetings today, and people use this word morality a lot, and people use it to mean different things. So when they say they study morality, it often can mean like 50 different kinds of things. So I want to start to delineate what I mean. So when I say I study morality, really what I study is moral judgment. And what I'm going to be talking to you today, for the most part, is basically, and the data are going to be mostly self-report. I'm sort of interested in the question of moral judgment. So, humans do this pretty weird thing, which is that we're really concerned about what other people are up to. And if they do certain kinds of behaviors, then we desire that we impose costs, that someone impose costs on those individuals, right? So to put it more colloquially, we punish people who do bad things. And what I'm going to argue today is really at the heart of what I would argue is the main answer to the question of why are we like that. And UCLA is sort of the perfect way, or the perfect place to talk about this. He's no longer here, but Rob Boyd, I think was one of the most important movers in this area, talking about why it is that people engage in third-party condemnation. So I condemn things that other people are doing, even if I'm not a participant in the transaction. And what I do here in parentheses is sort of say, look, it might be one thing or it might be lots of different things. I'm going to be somewhat agnostic to begin with on this topic, but I am super interested in the question of moral judgment. I mean, as a zoological matter, and we can argue about the details, I'm a little hesitant to say this in an anthropology department, but it's pretty weird for organisms to get involved in transactions where they or their kin or their allies are not themselves involved, particularly if there's no effects on them, their kin or their allies, relatively distal ones. And what I would argue, and I'll talk about this a little bit down the road, is that what's even weirder about humans is that we get really bent out of shape when unrelated individuals do things that are good for them and for us, where there's positive as opposed to negative consequences. And I think that's a super big clue about what's going on with moral judgment. So I'm interested, and I should say here, again, when I talk about morality in this presentation, I'm really going to be talking about moral judgment. And I want to slice that off in particular because I'm not interested in this conversation about what you might call moral behavior. So why do people choose to do nice things, particular altruistic things? And that's also important in this context because even Darwin, when he was talking about morality, he, at least in certain contexts, conflated altruism and morality. So he was sort of interested in explaining morality, and by that he often was referring to fellow feeling about sort of doing nice things for other people. So I'm going to talk about this question, and now it works. Okay, cool. And this is going to be a purely destructive presentation. I'm going to do nothing productive during this talk. I'm mostly aiming the work that I'll be presenting here at undermining one particular view about the function of moral judgment. And then, of course, there'll be a little bit of a hint about some productive parts. But really, this is just an enterprise in sort of Popperian destruction. Now, whether it actually destroys anything, I don't know, but that sort of thing. And this is the claim that I'm aiming at, is that this idea that moral judgments are not well to deter. And then the positive part will be this piece here, which is to say that if it's not for deterrence, it might be this other thing, which might have something to do with coordination. So I picked John Haidt to pick on here since, he's a fellow East Coast guy now, and he does have some history here on the West Coast. But this is a relatively clear statement of what he thinks is going on in morality. Also, he's arguably the most prominent person on the psychology side talking about moral psychology in general, but the evolutionary explanations for moral psychology in particular. So here's a quote from Perspectives on Psychological Science, where he refers to moral systems as interlocking sets of values, practices, institutions, and evolved psychological mechanisms. So that's quite the conjunction there. And what they do is they suppress selfishness. So it seems to me this is a fairly clear statement about what they're up to, is that they're suppressing selfishness. They are reducing other people's doing things that are good for them, bad for other people, roughly. And the material that surrounds John Haidt's comment here supports that kind of an interpretation. I would also say, as a general matter, I think it's fair to say that other scholars endorse a similar position, that some people have said that the reason that humans do this funny thing, punishing people who violate norms, is that punishment, by disinhibiting those behaviors, that is the breaking of these norms, lead to good consequences, often at the group level. He said carefully in the context of the UCLA Beck series. I think that is a fair characterization. And just to be clear, it seems to me, and this is where the epistemics of this talk will take us, is that it seems to me, although I think maybe people could argue with this, that if you find evidence that the characteristics of the moral judgment system, in many contexts, over and over, has features which make it bad at inhibiting people from doing social welfare destroying things, that each one of those observations should shake your confidence in the view that it's designed for that thing, as a general sort of view about how we think about evolution, evidence for different kinds of evolutionary principles. So, oops. This is another quote from the same source. Actually, this is from a more recent source, but by and large, this is a relatively common statement about what's going on with morality. Now notice here, and this I think is a sort of a public service announcement. I think that when people use the word morality, they should always be talking about whether they're talking about behavior or judgment, and in many contexts they don't, which I think has led to some confusion, but I'm not going to perseverate on that. So if you think that my judgment to punish Dan for violating a social norm is for social welfare improvements, is to deter him from doing things that are harmful as a general matter, like that are going to harm, let's say, that are going to lead to outcomes that are welfare diminishing, we know a lot about what the design of that system should look like, what a deterrence system should look like, what should the design features be of a deterrence system. So the scholarship goes back a long way. So here's a remark from the 18th century about how if you're going to build a deterrence system, this is specifically referring to institutions, so a justice system, but the logic for evolutionary biology is the same, is that what you really have to do to deter is it's really simple. What you do is you ask the question, what is the expected value of the benefit of the action to the person doing it? And the expected value includes the probability that they're going to get the result that they want and the magnitude of the benefit they're going to get. And then I just have to punish you with an expected value that's bigger than that. Right? Again, with the probability of how likely it is I'm going to catch you and punish you, and then the magnitude of the punishment. Right? So this is the natural inequality for a deterrence system. Super straightforward, not hard to implement. So if you are a plant and you want to deter a caterpillar from eating you, what you have to do is you have to secrete toxins that increase the cost of munching on your leaves, such that the cost of munching on your leaves is bigger than the nutritional benefit that you get from the plant. And at the point where that marginal cost, the next unit of toxin, is higher than the next marginal unit of nutrition, and you're a caterpillar, you're going to stop eating. This is the quintessential deterrence system. Part of what I'm saying with this is it's not that hard to build something like this. Like, this is an easy thing to build. That plant did it, and that plant is even less intelligent than Dan. I'm just kidding. No, right? Like, it's a little bit. Like, super simple to build a deterrence system. You see it all over the place. We build them all the time, right? So the sign is basically a deterrence system. So I just want to, what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is talk about a few lines of research, and I will, right now, I guess I will say all of the stuff that I'm going to be talking to you about today is in collaboration with Chris Smith, who's my current graduate student, and this is a direction that he's taken me. And so all these data are with him, and he was the prime mover in all these things. So the first thing I'll be talking about is this point about benefits. I'll talk, and in general, what a harm deterrence device should do is, if I'm trying to deter Dan, what I really want to do is I want to figure out what's the benefit he's going to get. Does he intend to get those benefits? Because if he doesn't, then I can't deter him, right? Like, I can't deter someone who doesn't intend to do something which is nefarious, right? I'll talk a little bit about consequentialism. Well, in this talk I won't, but here is a point that I want to step on, which no one gets, but I will step on it again anyway, which is, in the same way that the plant cares about the consequences to itself, and that's what it wants to deter. It wants to deter losing its leaves. If you were, from first principles, if you were going to build a deterrence system, the main psychological component that the psychology should look at, and in fact the only component it should look at, is what are the consequences of the action. A system designed to deter harm should care about the extent to which the action in question causes harm. It should care about the consequences of the action. And sort of just to put this here for the moment, and I'll return to it, it shouldn't care how that harm comes about. The deterrence system isn't about deterring harm in a particular way, right? So it'd be weird if the plant was designed to deter caterpillars eating it if it used its mouth, but not if it used a straw or something. Okay, that was a weird example. I don't know where that came from. But like, it shouldn't matter, right? It just doesn't matter how the plant leaves get eaten. What it wants to do is deter the eating of the plant leaves. Yes, I'm used to these puzzled expressions. So the meaning should be irrelevant. So, and I'm going to, and again, and here, I take it sensible people might disagree with that, and I say that because I know Rob Boyd is both sensible and not in agreement. All I'm saying is, it seems weird if you think that the moral judgment system is designed to stop people from doing things that cause harm, to find a lot of cases in which people are stopping people from doing things that cause no harm. Like, every time you find one of those things, you should think, huh, that's weird. Why would the moral judgment system be designed to stop people from doing harmless things? You should be even more surprised if it stops people from doing things which are beneficial, which are mutually beneficial. Right? It's like engaging in mutually consensual contracts in which both are better off. That would be really weird. Like, if you kept finding that over and over, you might say, hey, wait a minute, maybe this isn't a deterrent system. Maybe something else is going on with moral judgment. Questions so far? Okay. Now, coordination devices, and I'm not going to say a lot about this, have different predictions about the design features that you would expect. So if I'm just trying to do the same thing that everyone else is doing, and that's the goal is not deterrence. I just want to condemn people in the same way, like I just want to make a guess about what Dan's going to condemn and what everyone else is going to condemn. You're my example because you're right here, and I know, yeah. Then if I think he's going to condemn beneficial things or something that is beneficial, I'd be like, okay, well, I don't care about the deterrence thing. What I care about is being on the same page that Dan is on. So sometimes I'm going to deter things that are harmful, and some things I'm going to deter things, or I'm going to condemn things that are harmful, and sometimes I'm going to deter things or condemn things that are beneficial. And what I'm really going to care about is the intensity. I'm going to care, we're going to have to make ultimately decisions. You really want, in moral judgments, you really want to attend to the signals that are clear, because coordination is going to turn on the clarity of those signals. Now, the contents of deterrence of moral judgments is going to be arbitrary. I'll return to this a little bit later. And if it's just a coordination thing, we don't care if these acts are harmless. We don't care, right? All I want to do is make sure when Fred does behavior B, if everybody else thinks that we should punish Fred, then I agree with that. Even if what Fred's doing is, watering the roses or whatever beneficial thing he's doing. And then if all of that is true, we wouldn't be surprised by this necessarily. It depends on how these things are minted. And I'll talk a little bit more about these things. So this is now, there's Chris Smith there, slightly cut off in this version of the presentation. So what Chris and I did was we said, okay, let's ask the following question. Let's go into the literature and just ask, to what extent is it true as an empirical matter that people's moral judgments track the expected value of the benefits to perpetrators as would be expected from a deterrence model? That's the standard prediction from a deterrence model is, do people's intuitions about punishment track benefits? What we found, he persuaded me that this is true, and I'm open, like if people know if this is not true, I'm happy to hear it. Like this might not be the case. We couldn't find anything where people are measuring that. Like, do people's punishment decisions track benefits? And we thought about that, and we think we knew why that is. And it turns out, what we decided was, it's because it's really hard to systematically vary the costs and benefits in a kind of a vignette scenario. So for the rest of the talk, I'll be talking about exclusively vignette data. And I recognize there's limitations on that. We can talk about the details of the limitations of that. But so here's what we did. So we wanted to vary. So we wanted a scenario in which you have a victim and you have a perpetrator, and you can systematically vary the extent to which harm and benefit occur. And the reason this is hard is, so if I take $1 from Dan, he's down $1 and I'm up $1, and it seems hard to figure out how I could vary one but not the other. So we talked about this a little bit. And what we did, we think we found a way, and so I'll tell you the vignette in a second, and then we just rate the extent to which people think that the action in question is wrong and whether or not they deserve punishment. And this is an online sample from Amazon's Mechanical Turk. And here's the general thing. We've struggled with what the best way is to measure moral wrongness. So the one that we're using right now, for those of you who care, is we have these anchor point systems. So how wrong is Dave's action? 0 is cooking, which is whatever. A noise disturbance is 1. 5 is buying stolen property from the person who stole it. And then 25 is shooting someone to death. So it's sort of this is a scale that others have used. We find it's a little bit less noisy than some of the other scales. And then we have a punishment thing here too. Not linear, but a prison sentence scale. So here's how we varied costs and benefits. It's a little Baroque, but here's what we did. Imagine there's these two objects, and each one by themselves, according to the market, is worth $100. But if you have them both together, they're worth a lot more. So this is like the way we think about this, and I think it's a comic book, but you could painting. So imagine you have a painting of a, can I say king and queen, or is that monarchical and therefore violate our politically correct? I can say that. Okay, king and queen, yeah. So you have a king and a queen portrait, and they're both valuable. But if you put them together as a matched set, then they're super valuable, right? So in the one scenario, this person has the blue one. Green person steals the blue one, right? And so in the default scenario, he's down 100 and he's up 100. But now, if the victim has the king or the queen, now if this gets stolen, he's up 100, but this person is down 1900. So we've disentangled. So now we can systematically vary. Now we can do the reverse case, right? So the perpetrator has the other one. And I should say, Chris did the animation on the slide. This is beyond my PowerPoint skills, so you can tell. Now he's up 1900 and whatever. So what that allows us to do is use scenarios that are identical in all respects except for who starts with the thing in question, so that there's an asymmetry in the costs and benefits. And so just to lay out what the normal, and this is a manipulation check, but what you should predict on a normal everyday deterrence account is that if you ask me how much I want to punish the perpetrator, again, on a deterrence account, what you should find is that I should want to punish them more as the benefit to the perpetrator goes up, and I shouldn't actually care about the effect on the victim, the cost of the victim, as long as it's not 0. Right, so the deterrence view is that I focus my attention on the benefit to the perpetrator. That's the standard normal everyday prediction. So first, manipulation check. We know that they correctly viewed harm and benefit. Yeah, this is the downside of this PowerPoint presentation. You can't see, I did label my data here. So on the right is high harm, on the left is low harm. If you could see my computer, I could prove this to you, but you'll have to take my word for it. So we know that the manipulation check was okay. And then what you're seeing here is the difference in wrongness judgments. And what you're seeing is that the judgments about wrongness are tracking the harm, but they're not tracking the benefits. So people say that something is more wrong to the extent that it imposes more of a cost on the victim. By the way, I'm showing you the theft example. We did other examples, and all of them, I confess, are slightly stilted. I can give you the pros if you want. It's hard to do these in a way that's not a little bit stilted, but we have scenarios with, that are in other domains beyond the twin paintings. And we also see a small but significant effect of punishment. So you can see the eta square there is quite modest. And again, what you're seeing is that people's punishment decisions are tracking the harm, but they're not tracking the benefit. So for those of you who care about the regression, we have a paper which we're in the process of writing up right now. For those of you who want to see it, it's nearly done. But here is the bottom line. And we've now run this a couple times, so we're fairly confident in this result. What you find is that if you think of wrongness and punishment as little terms here in these equations, what you're finding is that people's judgments about harm, or people's judgments about punishment and also wrongness are tracking the harm caused. And the effect, you see a tiny little effect of wrongness here for benefit and nothing different from zero for punishment. And then you have a funny little interaction term. Yeah?
Cool. I think I'm managing to pick this up about why the deterrence account says that what I should be tracking is the benefit. It seems like what I want to deter is the harm, not the benefit. I don't want to deter people benefiting a whole bunch. I don't care if this guy is up, $1,900, good for him. I don't want to deter that. The thing I want to deter is this poor victim being victimized.
So the notion of a deterrence account focuses on the decision being made by the perpetrator. What you want to do is when the perpetrator is taking a decision about whether or not to steal the picture, right? We're assuming, which you have to more or less in these sorts of accounts, you're assuming that the decision maker is more or less someone who's computing the different costs and benefits and making a decision based on those costs and benefits. And what you want to do is at the moment of decision, you want the person who's doing the putative wrong to include the potential cost against the potential benefit that they're going to get so that their expected value is less than zero. So it's true that what you're trying to deter is the cost, but the thing you want to influence is the decision. And so that's why you need to influence the benefit computation, or that's why you need to take into account the benefit computation.
Yeah, that's helpful. So on the hard version of this account, the perceived harm to the other persons and the second order harms that might befall me as a consequence of being a big jerk face, these aren't things that are integrated.
Yeah, so we definitely do not add the big jerk face component into the model this time. Yeah, but the jerk face stuff, I say that a little bit flippantly, but that actually we do think that's super important. So I just came from a conference in Princeton where someone was showing some data looking at second and third party punishment, where it looks like, and this is something that I hope I'll talk to Dan about later on, it looks like in the subjects that they were describing, third party punishment is positively moralized. So it is a virtue for me to hit Dan on the head if he steals your taco. But revenge is negatively moralized. And so you get these really interesting effects where if you know there's an audience, you tend to be a third-party punisher but not a vengeful person, and that has to do with the jerk face thing. It has to do with representations about other people's, like representation, you know what I mean? Yeah. Is that clear? Yeah, yeah, but sure. Yeah. So, and as I said, we've now done this a couple times. I think as a general matter, I feel comfortable saying that subjects' judgments, at least in these data sets, are to a much greater extent tracking the harm more than the benefits, and there might not even be, like it's hard to say exactly here, but there might not even be much of a benefit effect. And we've gotten this in multiple domains. So, and I should say also one nice thing about these, like one thing we could have found was that people are tracking both the costs and the benefits, and we're just really not find that much for the benefits. Now, we also know from other data that there is that in certain domains there's a close relationship between moral judgment, desires for punishment, and magnitude of harm caused. So at least it's consistent with that. But what we know is that, at least we think we know, is that people are more or less tossing out the benefit information. Okay, I'm going to switch gears now to a second line of work. And what we're interested in is, so I'm going to go back to this point about victimless crime, or sorry, I'm going to go back to this point about intentions and so on. So this is a set of studies that's looking at the distinction between attempted and completed crimes. So the intuition here, this is tough because your intuitions are telling you that we should punish attempted crimes way less. Like most people think that. But from all I'm saying is, again, on a hard version of a deterrence view, what you really want, you don't want to deter. So the distinction is, right, so I shoot at Dan, he ducks, I miss him. Now I'm guilty of attempted murder. I get 2 years in jail. If he doesn't duck or he slips on a banana or whatever, I get 25 if he doesn't duck. So from a deterrence view, that's not logical. What you want to do from a deterrence view is, at the moment I'm thinking about pulling the trigger, independent of if he happens to get lucky subsequently. You want to deter me from doing that, right? So what we're going to look at, one of the test cases that we wanted to look at here was, again, victimless crimes. Because you could say, and this is what people have said in both the scholarly literature and the psychological literature, we got really interested in this for this reason, is they said, well, in an attempted crime, only one bad thing has happened, which is I've tried to kill Dan. In a completed crime, two things that are bad have happened. I've tried to kill Dan and Dan is dead. Right? And so there's both a harm and an intent to harm. And so you could say, well, what really is going on is people's intuitions are being driven by the fact that there's two things have happened. That was the main, legal scholars wrestle with this all the time, because many people both in psychology and in the legal field, they really do think that law somehow should be designed to deter. So what we did is, well, what about cases where there's no harm? And by harm here, I really mean it in the sense that evolutionists would recognize it. So I don't count harm, like if God is crying or whatever, I don't count that as a harm. Like someone has to have less stuff, or someone's body has to be damaged, like, or a minimum, like representations of reputation have to be undermined. Like there has to be harm, like fitness harm. Like somehow there has to be that. And so we used some cases where, at least to our way of thinking, there's no harm done. My favorite case, which I've been thinking about a lot for a long time now, is prostitution. So this is obviously not coercive prostitution, consensual prostitution, where I have something which is sex and someone else wants to buy it, and so I sell it, we arrange on a price, we do the transaction. I'm better off because I have money, the person's better off because I got sex. And I admit here too, the vignettes are slightly stilted, right? So it was difficult to build a scenario where you attempt and yet fail to engage in prostitution, although it's not, you can imagine what that scenario is sort of like. In most of these scenarios, an interruption occurs. So, the transaction is stopped in virtue of, something happens. So we were interested in the following question. So we're like, well, if it's true that the harm piece is what makes completed crimes worse, then in these attempted cases, can we flatten out the difference between attempted and completed crimes? Does that difference go away? And our prediction was that it wouldn't go away. And the intuition here doesn't matter too much, but basically and I'll go back here for a second. For a coordination case, it's just easier to coordinate if something actually happened. So this is the traffic light case. So when there's actually an event that took place as opposed to an event that's trying to take place, it's easier for us all to agree on what the event that took place was, right? There's actually evidence out in the world. So coordination is easier when the tort, the wrong, leaves something in the world to have happened so that we can all coordinate on that event. And this is what we find. So we do a bunch of these things: drug use, flag burning, prostitution, injury, and theft. And for every single case, although the size of the effects obviously varies, and I should say that, right, so these were the sort of the control category. So it's true that in our victimless cases, these effects are smaller, but the effect is reliable. And I want to take a hot second here just to pause on a point, and this actually came up in my morning meetings. This piece of work is kind of continuous with a broader set of work that makes the following claim. So our claim is that whenever some behavior is moralized, so like smoking. So out here, right? So I don't know to what extent Silicon Valley is an accurate portrayal of Northern California culture, but like one of the jokes in Silicon Valley is that someone smokes and it's treated as if they've burned a child with an iron or something like that. Like it's like a primal sin. The argument that we make, I think Dan would be sympathetic to this, is that once an action is moralized, it takes on all of the computational architecture of everything else that gets moralized. All of the normal everyday phenomena get attached to that. So as soon as something is moralized, you get the action-omission distinction, which is a famous effect in psychology. You get the attempted-completed distinction. You get the means-end distinction. You get all of the, it's almost like the psychological architecture says, look, as soon as something is deemed wrong, then everything that I know about morality applies to it. It's like there's an insert here function. And this is potentially important because what it suggests is that moral normative content is not a basket of disparate things. It's actually one thing. There's one phenomena that go across lots of different domains, but it's actually one thing because the same kinds of computational aspects, whatever you want to call them, processes, get attached as soon as something is moralized. We can't find anything where the attempted completed distinction goes away. We can't find anything where the act-omission distinction goes away. We can't find anything where the means-end distinction goes away. They pop up everywhere. So, and then we've run this again, so many of you know that these days it's super important. I mean, it's always been important to replicate your work, but now it's sort of been moralized not to replicate your stuff. I mean, let's say that out loud, right? And so we've gotten a couple times. We get a funny thing in one of our cases. So drug use doesn't replicate nicely. So I'm not sure what to make of that. So one nice thing about this is it forwards two of our pieces of our agenda. The first thing is it advances the notion that in general, processes that adhere to moral contents in general get adhered to all different moral contents in general. So again, you have sort of an insert here function for morality. And the second thing is we now know, or at least we think, that the attempted completed distinction is not coming from the notion of harm caused. Okay, so the last set of studies that I'll talk about today is going to this is going to be drifting into slightly philosophical territory, but we found it sort of interesting. And it turns on the following idea, again, in the context of deterrence. In the context of deterrence, if Dan is going to steal my taco, then the logic of deterring him should be identical whether we all think that Dan knows where my taco is hidden, or if Dan just thinks he knows where my taco is hidden. In both cases, you equally want to deter him from attempting to steal my taco. Like, it should not matter how confident he is about where my taco is. Like, if he went to steal my taco and he was only kind of like, let's use certainty as it's almost the same, but let's use certainty as a metric here. And, he wasn't sure at all. At the moment, again, he's taking the decision, given his belief, however weak, about stealing the taco or about where the taco is. You want him to compute, okay, I believe I will get punished because I'll get caught with some probability and the punishment with some magnitude, which is greater than the expected value of stealing Rob's taco, right? And it shouldn't, again, you don't care about the epistemic status of his belief about where my taco is. That's irrelevant to the deterrence view. So it would be weird if it turns out that the extent to which I want to punish Dan, or the extent to which I think it's wrong, turns, particularly in weird ways, on his beliefs about where my taco is. So we're going to limit it to this belief and knowledge case. So we're not going to do confidence, we're just going to do belief and knowledge. And I'll show you what the distinction that philosophers draw between these things. And what I'm going to be asking here is, do we in fact, ask yourself, first your intuitions are probably telling you where the answer goes, but just ask yourself, what does the deterrence view say about that distinction, about whether he thinks or knows where my taco is? I don't know where that, okay. So here's one way to think about the distinction between knowledge and belief. In a criminal context, a defendant is charged with a murder and he appears to be guilty. He has motive and there's no alibi or exonerating evidence. Everyone is convinced of his guilt. Still, he hires the best defense attorney. Realizing he cannot win by reasoning, he charms the juror into believing his client's innocence, and they rule in his favor. As it turned out, the defendant was truly innocent. And so you can ask this question. I know you can't see that in the back. It says, do the jurors know, and it's in red, the defendant's innocence or merely believe it? And so these are the kinds of ways that philosophers have invited you to consult your intuitions about what it means for someone to believe something and what it means for someone to know something. This also raises this question. So again, in philosophy, people have talked quite a bit about justified true belief. So an agent has a justified true belief. So an agent S knows proposition P. If and only if P is true, S believes P to be true, and S has justification for believing P to be true. So this is sort of the canonical. These would be, well, they were offered as necessary and sufficient conditions for a subject knowing a proposition. So here they are. And what we're going to play around with in these last two lines of work is this last link here. What we're gonna argue, and what I'll try to show you, is that there is a link between my belief about the knowledge that an agent has and the extent to which I condemn them. So this is the vignette we use, for those of you who know, this is Josh Knobe's work on a CEO and the environment. So the basic vignette is there's a CEO and he's thinking about implementing a particular project, and he's either told or not that the project will either harm or help the environment, and then he has to make a decision about whether or not he wants to do the program. So we have a branching structure here. So on the left-hand branch, the CEO believes the environment will not be harmed, and on the right-hand branch, he believes the environment will be harmed. And what we're going to do is we're going to have, in the one case, he believes this because of his intuition, and in the other case, he believes this because he read a scientific report. And so you can map these onto the principles that I just told you about, right? So his intuition is an unjustified false belief in this case. So on the left, this is a false belief. It turns out in all of these things, just to be clear, the environment is always harmed, poor environment. So the bad thing happens in all these cases. So on the left, this is an unjustified false belief. This is a justified false belief. Here's an unjustified true belief, and this is a justified true belief. So this is the vignette. The vice president of a company went to the chairman of the board and said, we're thinking of starting a new program. We're sure that it will help us increase profits, but there's a possibility it will hurt the environment. The chairman of the board answered, I don't have any evidence for it, so this is the intuition case, but my gut tells me it will or will not hurt the environment. Therefore, I'm confident the program will or will not hurt the environment. And then he says, I don't care about hurting the environment. I just want to make as much profit as I can. Let's start the new program. The company started the new program. The chairman was correct or he was wrong. The environment was harmed by the new program, right? And so this is the unjustified belief case. This is justified belief case. For these scales, we use sort of more traditional Likert scales, not at all wrong to very much wrong. We ask subjects about blame, and then some epistemic items here. So the chairman believed his decision would harm the environment, disagreed to agree. So we're asking sort of, this is more or less an assay of what his beliefs and knowledge were according to the subjects, and then this is their moral views on it. So what we find is, I'll just bring those all in, is that just taking the data on the left-hand side first, so you'll see that in the case of an unjustified false belief case, you'll see that both belief and know are relatively short, or that is on the lower side. Then if you move to the right, in the justified true belief case, so you'll see that the biggest attribution of knowledge is in the justified true belief case, which sort of makes sense, right? So we think that, so one way to think about this is just to continue with the vignette. So when he has his intuitions, and that's where his knowledge is coming from, people are less willing to attribute knowledge to the CEO than they are in the justified true belief case. So if you simply have an intuition, you're identical. I think I've got I don't have the error bars in there. You're identical in terms of your belief, but you're attributed more knowledge if it's justified. And then what we're interested in is the condemnation. And what we find is, if you have a true belief and it's justified, then the extent to which people condemn you goes up. So if you're the CEO and you've made the decision, you've taken the decision based on having read a scientific report, even though your beliefs, as we just saw in the previous slide, are the same, then you are considered more morally culpable by our subjects than in the case in which when it's driven by your intuitions. So the idea here is, if he knew for a good reason, it's worse than if he believed for a good reason, then he's worse than if he believed for a bad reason. These are the effect sizes. So by and large, what we find here, and this is leading to the next piece here, is that your condemnation is influenced by the extent to which your belief or knowledge is justified. So the epistemics of the CEO matter. So we wanted to move on to these cases. I was talking to Clark about this last night. So Gettier cases are apparently super famous in philosophy. I had never heard of them. This is another indication that this is all Chris, not me. But here's the canonical case. So Bob has a friend, Jane, who's driven the same Ford car for many years. Bob reasons Jane drives an American car. However, Bob does not realize that Jane's car was recently stolen and that she replaced it with a Chevy, another American car. So does Bob know that Jane drives an American car, or does he merely believe it? So in some sense, this is a case, the way to think about this is that Bob is sort of accidentally right? So he's got a justification, but it's not the right justification. He sort of got there by accident. So Gettier cases involve some form of luck. And what we know from subjects' intuitions and surveys is that justified true belief is not sufficient for knowledge, you need something else. So there's some magic ingredient that is needed. And that's what we're going to interrogate here. So the setup is almost exactly the same. So in the unjustified true belief case, the CEO knows this because of his intuition. So in the Gettier case, so he reads the scientific report, but the report had an error in it. So his belief about the fact that the environment will be harmed will turn out to be a true belief, but it will have gotten there in virtue of just being lucky. So he doesn't believe the report. He says, I refuse, I can't believe this is true, so blah, blah, blah. And then he's got the justified true belief. So you don't need to read all of this. This is just the text that we use to work to describe it. And what we find is the following. Whoops. Sorry about that. So once again, what we find is that in the case of an unjustified belief, you get a big penalty in terms of knowledge. So for knowledge, you've got an intermediate case in the Gettier instance. And what we're really concerned about is this. And what we find is that the Gettier case and the unjustified belief are not statistically different from each other. And they're both less than the justified case. So in other words, having a Gettier belief is slightly, not huge, but is somewhat exculpatory. Right? So in other words, if you have this, if your route to this belief was from this avenue that turned out to not to be the actual avenue by which one would normally have gotten to that actually justifies it, that subjects view this as exculpatory. It's not nearly as bad, it's less bad, let's say. Again, these aren't big effects, but they also, the idea here is that what Gettier beliefs look in this instance like unjustified beliefs. I should say we've also started to run some path analyses on this, and what it looks like is all of this is being driven by the extent to which the subjects are reporting the extent to which the person knew it. So knowledge is the driving characteristic here. That's what we haven't finished those analyses yet. This is all stuff that came in the last couple of weeks, so we haven't looked at all the data. But by and large, what it looks like is that the details of how people's beliefs about about morally relevant facts of the case are influencing people's moral condemnation. Is that a question in the back? No. So let me just conclude with a few, sort of summarize what I think we're up to here. So the way I sort of think about this, and these next two slides are sort of supposed to be what I'm hoping you'll take away from this, is that I think there are relatively straightforward predictions which are being made by harm deterrence, by the hypothesis that moral judgment is a harm deterrence device. And the first one, in the first study I showed you here, is that it doesn't look like people are attending to benefits. Now, I want to be cautious, right? These are the beginnings of this research agenda. We have, I think, a long way to go, but to some extent, at least, it undermines my confidence in that particular component. The second thing is that there are harmless offenses, and sensible people can disagree about how many of these there are. It seems to me there are a lot of them, that if you look historically and cross-culturally, that there are many moral contents that seem to include things which are not harmful. I'm happy to engage that during the Q&A. And the last couple of studies suggest that the epistemics matter. And we can talk about, I didn't try to provide you with our explanation for why these things matter, but at minimum what you can say is that at this point it really looks like, in contrast to what you would expect from the taco case that I use as an example, the distinction between belief and knowledge really matters. And the intuition here is going to be something like this. If it's true that what really matters is that we're coordinating our activity, these funny philosophical cases make it harder as a third party to persuade other people about the moral wrong that's having been committed. And we can talk about that in the discussion. We know for sure that intentions work in very funny ways in the context of moral condemnation. I didn't talk about moral luck, but we know from other data that while it's true that intentions frequently do matter in a lot of moral judgment contexts, again, depending on the cultural details, there are various places in which people more or less throw out, where the intentions don't play the role that they ought to for a deterrent system. And then one of the things I have not talked about here, just because people have talked about this so much, are cases like trolley problems, where we know for sure that there's at least there's at least some cases where people are making judgments about wrongness that don't turn on the consequences. And in particular, the means of harm matter. That it's okay to flip a switch to kill one to save five, but it's not okay to push a guy to kill one to save five. So we've sort of been trying to interpret these results in the context of something like a coordination view. And the reason that I'm not trying to advance this agenda here. I'm not trying to say necessarily that I think that a particular coordination view can explain all those results. What I'm trying to say is, it seems to me that the deterrence view makes relatively straightforward, easily comprehensible predictions, and when we look at the balance of the evidence for lots of different components of it, that's not what we see. We think that there are other ways to interpret these results which make a bit more sense if something else is going on, if the function of the moral judgment system has something to do with coordination as opposed to deterrence. And we think that there's a number of different features that this explains, which again I won't talk about here, and I also want to emphasize at the end that we recognize this is at this point a destructive agenda, and we look forward to also, we're very open to the idea that the particular details of the work that we've described here might also have alternative explanations, but at this point we feel like a coordination kind of an explanation, even though in some sense it's a coordination explanation makes a different set of predictions, and in some sense they're not as strong. Like, the nice thing about a deterrence view is that if you take it literally, it makes strong predictions. A coordination view doesn't. And we accept that. And so we look forward to work that can disentangle these two approaches to understanding moral judgment. And with that, I'll acknowledge my collaborators and thank you for your attention. And then I do this little, whoops, yeah, there. Yeah, I saw your hand first.
I have both a general comment and a kind of a line of possible response on behalf of the deterrence theory. So the general comment is just, I guess, I was thinking that the contrast between the deterrence kind of picture and the coordination picture, one needs to be a little careful. They're, in a way, it's similar in some ways to the way in which, you can ask, are we better, will we get a better grip on thinking about morality from thinking about the prisoner's dilemma versus the stagnant? And you kind of think, it's not a great question because there are two different kinds of ways into thinking about moral problems, and the different kinds of cases will bring out different kinds of features. And so you might think a lot of these accounts are based on thinking of a very specific kind of problem. And then if they were, of course, to generalize to think that a wider variety of cases, including kinds of coordination cases, they would have to make certain kinds of provisos to incorporate some of the points you're saying, and in particular, the contrast might be not as sharp. So that's just a general comment. Maybe the deterrence and coordination aren't as different, but the more specific thing I was kind of thinking on behalf of the deterrence theorists is just, it's a kind of version of, you might call it like revealed deterrence theory. So you're thinking about deterrence via the particular choices. And as you said, intentions matter, but only as those intentions are revealed in the particular choices. So it has a kind of deeply consequentialist flavor to it. And you might think, well, there's a version of deterrence view that focuses more on the internal procedures and not the choices, and so it's not thinking about deterrence via just the way they're revealed through choices, but the structure of those internal devices or the procedures themselves. And so you're thinking about how do we get people to be in the kind of internal states that are going to be conducive to a well-ordered society or something. And then we start thinking, oh yeah, well maybe having certain kinds of preference sets are worse than others, or acting just out of belief rather than knowledge is it's going to lead to a less well-organized society. So, it's kind of think about deterrence of people being in certain internal states rather than other internal states. Maybe that's a weird form of deterrence theory, but at the very least, there seems to be ways to make the view less consequentialist. And the more that you make the view less consequentialist, the less susceptible to some of the worries it will be to
well, there was a lot there. I'm not quite sure how to respond to it. On the first point, I'm absolutely in favor of exercising care. I would say I don't think of the I wouldn't have used Prisoner's Dilemma and Stag Hunt as a good analogy between deterrence views and coordination views. Well, I would say this, and I don't say this often, but in rooms like this I will. It's like, I guess I would say, look, the whole point of the adaptationist analysis is supposed to be saying something about what design features you expect conditional on some proposed function. And now we can either be serious about that or not. And so I guess, and that connects to your second point too, which is I get frustrated when I hear a view about a purported function, and then I'm subsequently told, yeah, but I didn't actually mean that. I didn't somehow mean it was going to have design features which were actually going to be good at doing that, because there's all sorts of exceptions and things are complicated. Yeah, things are complicated, but as a first pass, it seems to me, that I don't really view consequentialism as something which we can easily abandon. I don't just mean that for a deterrence account. Like, I think that almost any account of moral condemnation, most accounts that I've seen, require a focus on the consequences, the intended consequences of the action as the crucial variable which you should psychologically be attending to. And that's because in all of these different functions, you're trying to bring about a change in decisions. And that change in decisions you're trying to bring about in virtue of something that's going to happen in the world. And so it seems to me that that consequentialism should be the main component. I don't know. I always talk about, I don't know. I like this example of the burying beetle. If you're a burying beetle, and I might get the biology wrong, but you give birth to some offspring, you stick around, and if there's too many of them to feed on the carcass of the mouse, you eat your offspring and then regurgitate them and feed them to the other offspring. And that's a hard, I presume that computation is hard, and yet they seem to do it, right? And we, if a human did that, that would be bad, I guess. You shouldn't eat one kid and then feed it the other kid. That's sort of not super cool, right? To me, it illustrates, that's in some way solving the trolley problem every single day. These guys are, and it's not hard. That's not complicated. I take the point. One way to read your second comment is that, look, things are complicated, and the psychology is going to be complicated, right? Is that not one way to put it? No?
Yeah, in some senses, it's just that the thought is something like the deterrence theory can think about mental states as being kind of intervening variables in the behavior, and you might think what matters and what the theory is tracking is how these intervening variables are operating. And so it is thinking about...
Well, I'm willing to concede that, but wait, it also seems to me that once you get to that point, it's fairly clear what the intervening variables ought to be. Like, at that point, intentions should matter, and beliefs about whatever is relevant to the moral action,
and
right?
The difference between knowledge and belief might matter at that level, right? Because you might think you should act out of knowledge, not out of belief, and or so you should. Here's a norm: only act or only say things that you know. Only perform actions that you have where you're in certain knowledge states, or only make assertions if you know the content of the assertion. That would be a different state than just saying something because you believe it's so, or because somebody told you yesterday that it's so. And so those kinds of distinctions would then be open, as it were, to be appealed to from the point of view of deterrence.
Yeah, I guess I just don't, I think what I would say is that I guess I take the deterrence view at its word for what it is, and I take the point that there might be other ways to get there, but let me see what else the room is, and then we can maybe circle back. Is that cool? Yeah? Yeah.
So I actually agree with you that that there are plenty of moralized actions which don't involve harm, and that the focus on harm is to a certain extent a culturally variable one. But I want to give you the opportunity to defend your method against what I envision skeptics would pose as a reasonably cogent critique, and that's that the problem with the sort of moral dumbfounding style of argument in which you present what appears to be a harmless action is that participants' representations of those actions are embedded in larger informational schemas in which there is harm, right? So, the consensual exchange of goods for sex seems like a harmless action unless you embed it in a world in which either most prostitution takes place in the context of exploitation, or one in which sex outside of particular kinds of relationships is seen as having negative consequences for children produced, for society at large, and so on, right? And therefore that when you tell participants, you must stay within the frame that I am giving you in the experiment, right? I have told you there is no harm here, right? And you must believe me. That's a difficult thing for participants to do because they know a lot about the world that they bring to the experiment. And so their intuitions as to whether or not harm is present or not are not easily disregarded along the path to making moral judgment.
So can I say, I don't know if you're in the middle, but let me say a couple things before I forget. You know I'm an old man, so I forget things. But let me say a couple things. So one thing I would say is that we do manipulation checks, and so we know that, so to some extent we're able to answer questions about the perception of harm. So and there it's self-report, so that's whatever. The next thing I would say is that we have, right now in my group, we have the belief, and I think other people do too, although not everybody, that the process is really the reverse. So that once people, and this connects to your moral dumbfounding comment, once people have the intuition that a wrong has been committed, and we have some pretty good evidence for this actually, they are very fast. It's very easy for them to generate a candidate harm that has been done. And again, the comment about God crying was only partially sarcastic because when we ask people to talk about what harm was done, they make reference to supernatural agents, they talk about society, and so I think that's what you're kind of talking about. But for us, that's actually the downstream, not the upstream piece. And then the third thing I would say is that we're open to methods that would not be subject to that critique. If you can come up with vignettes, scenarios, contents that finesse that problem, we'd be very interested in those. In other work we went through, I think we have a list of 12 victimless crimes when we were looking at the act-omission distinction. And that was in the service of asking the question, does the act-omission distinction adhere across victimless crimes? And yeah, and you could say for all of those, you have this problem. And I agree with you. Like I think I credit the critique, and then I sort of say, well, what are we going to do? I think it's a very difficult critique to overcome, particularly if it's true that harm beliefs are manufactured post hoc. I should say that, in terms of the dumbfounding, so Ed Roisman at Penn has followed up. I mean, the funniest thing about the incest scenario in the dumbfounding paper is that no one's ever, he didn't report data in that paper, right? He reported the anecdotes from his lab. No one actually had reported data from that. We don't find that effect. Like we more or less can't get people to throw up their hands, at least in the studies that we've done. People always come up with some candidate reason. So, yeah, Clark.
Yeah, so thinking about the consequentialism issue, I'm with you 90% of the way through this, and I agree with your view on what a well-designed deterrence kind of psychology, what you kind of predict especially in an organism that has a fully functioning theory of mind and uses it.
Right.
And we do.
Yeah.
So I'm with you.
Yeah. Talk to me about this. Yeah, get me the 10%.
But we found, this PNAS paper that several of us here worked on, where we found interesting variation using vignettes in when and how people use intentions for making moral. So
just to stop you, that's where there's some strict liability cultures and stuff like that?
Well, we didn't find strict liability cultures per se, but we found scenarios or contexts where some cultures were strict liability.
Right, okay, fine. Yeah, sorry.
Others weren't.
Right.
Despite the fact that, so it would be easier to say some cultures strict liability
Yeah.
or not. That doesn't seem to be the case.
Okay.
It's more like people in some places are strict liability about some things.
Right.
And people in other places aren't. So, and I've been puzzling, and many of us, puzzling, like how to get a grip on this. But, so my question is, it seems like it could be possible. The outcomes of people's behavior. So take a Gettier case, right? Like, I believe that so-and-so drives an American car. You can gin up some crazy philosophical scenario, and some of us have done this kind of thing, where they're right for the wrong reasons. But you could also imagine plenty of contexts, including some of the, one of the cultures where I work, where when you ask people about those things, they're not super concerned about the pathway by which the person know what they do. They're just like, well, they're right.
I see.
Right?
Yeah, super cool.
And when you think about the Nove case, my intuition, and I don't know, and I'm sure there's been many attempts to look at this, is that what's going on with Nove is that, and I think he says this, when the CEO damages the environment, regardless of what he said before, right, that's evidence about something about his character, right? Even though you can make the scenario such that, it's an accident or a byproduct or whatever, right? Like the fact that this guy, the fact that there was an Exxon Valdez oil spill, maybe you could say, we can call these bad people. And in a world where you maybe don't, maybe the culture or whatever leads you to believe that it's hard to know what their true intentions are, you value those, you value the fact there was an oil spill more than whatever the guy might have said or whatever his family might have said about his intentions, right? Or whatever you said as an experimenter about their intentions, right? So what I'm getting at is, you want to be adaptationist, you want to be functionalist, I'm with you 100%, but it seems like there could be different designs for implementing a punishment system that don't focus as much on the intentions. And those could be ESSs.
Those could be, okay.
ESSs, they could be...
It's fine. Let me stop you there, if I could, because there's a lot there. So let me say a couple things. So first of all, on the character front, there's also tons of stuff, and you probably know this, where the character argument completely fails, right? So the drunk driving case. So I drive drunk, I hit somebody, you drive drunk, you hit nobody. We've learned nothing about my character in virtue of the fact that I happen to hit somebody and you didn't. And yet our intuitions about punishment there are completely different. Before the child got hit, who we are is exactly the same. And all I'm saying is, in some sense, agreeing with you. I'm just to say, the character argument can't be everything for sure. That's going to fail in moral luck kinds of cases. So that's one piece. A second piece is, and this is where I admit, this connects to where I wound up. If it's true that if something like the coordination story is true, the problem, the virtue of that story and the vice of that story is it actually connects with your point about ESSs. You can wind up anywhere. Like, as long as we all agree ex ante what the moral norm is, and that it could be a strict liability norm in this context, and a normal everyday liability norm, as long as we agree on that, you can wind up anywhere. So the virtue of that is I can explain weird stuff. The vice of that is I'm doing it for free, right? Like I have no, you can't, you know what I mean? It's not appropriately Popperian. So I agree with that. We actually take the fact that norm space is so widely populated as a virtue for the coordination view. Because most views that want to assign some actual function to morality, they ought to squish the norms in to get to that place, particularly a cultural evolution story. A cultural evolution story ought to be squishing norms into the place that gets them to whatever the thing that is being selected in terms of the norm. A coordination view allows these things to disperse. You know what I'm saying? So I guess part of what I'm saying there is that for that 10%, like I take your point. But and also, by the way, that connects up the consequentialism piece, because anyway, so in some sense we're trying to get this for free by saying that the coordination view doesn't commit us to particular points in norm space, right? And that, you know what I mean? And then the other, what was the last piece? I feel like I missed a chunk there.
Well, just that you could still have a functionalist. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
These cross-cultural variations where, it's this axis between really caring about having a very deep causal model about the causes of behavior and then going after the causes of behavior as your way of doing deterrence makes a whole lot of sense. But you could also see reasons why in some places and sometimes in some contexts the psychology might not do that or might weigh the
Yeah, I take that point.
way more heavily than
I like let me set up a account.
I mean,
Yeah.
I've arrived at this empirically because I used to think what you thought, and I thought these things would be.
Oh, I don't even know what I think.
And then, well, no, I mean, I thought there would be a universal architecture of theory of mind. Let's call it, intention reasoning, belief, desire reasoning, really coming first before the judgment, because that's what you'd expect in an organism that's equipped with that kind of psychology. That exactly all the things that you're saying. I shouldn't care about the difference between trying to shoot Dan and actually shooting Dan if the intention is trying to shoot Dan. I mean, that seems right to me. But then empirically we find...
No, but wait, let's be super clear.
Yeah.
Like, so that distinction is only something I should really worry about if I am genuinely committed to the normal, canonical, strong version of a deterrence view. I was studying that, see what I'm saying?
Sure.
I'm not committed to that. Like, by the way, let me be super clear about this. I'm not committed at all to the view that my account... So I'm not saying my account predicts the attempted completed distinction at all. I'm saying my account allows the attempted completed distinction. I'm saying a narrow version of the deterrent tree does not. That's what I'm trying to say. I think that's where part of the confusion might have been.
Distinguishing between the failed attempt and the successful outcome could be consistent with the deterrent psychology still.
Yeah, so that's your claim. I would love to see. I mean, I would need to do this offline in a much more careful way to see exactly how that works. I'm suspicious of that.
No, I get that.
Yeah.
I get it.
Can I take speaker's privilege and yeah.
So I'm thinking about the first experiment. I'm wondering, you said it was kind of hard to come up with that scenario.
Yeah.
If that was part of the issue with the design, is that it's not it's usually the case if I take something.
Yeah, the dollar case, yeah.
It's weird.
Yeah, I agree it's weird, and you should be skeptical about it to that extent. I mean, it's hard. As I said, we've done some other domains. I can send you the piece that talks about the scenarios. So.
Yeah.
But sorry, go ahead.
I can think of some scenarios where I benefit, and I feel like people would be morally more upset if I do benefit. So let's say there's a football game and there's a ref, and I harass the ref beforehand to try and get him to make my team win, and it actually worked and my team wins. Scenario A, my team won. Scenario B, I had $1 million on the game, and now I have $1 million. In both cases, the impact's the same. My team won. In one case, I get this huge benefit. I would think that most people would be a lot more upset if they found out I had $1 million on the game and I harassed them.
Yeah, I share that intuition.
Versus, I just wanted my team to win.
Yeah. No, I share that intuition. We have, run it, publish it. What can I tell you? Yeah, I would say what we were interested in is not just the finding about benefits per se, but having harm as a, trying to control those two. And the vignette that we have does that, right? So we can do the 2x2. Your vignette just varies.
I guess you could do the team loses, but they'll still make their playoffs, or if the team loses and now they won't make their playoffs.
Yeah. Well, and then in the $1 million case, there's also someone who's out $1 million, right? So there's a victim there. I'm open to these. I'm certainly open to methodological variations, but it's challenging. Yeah.
So I might, be creating a post-hoc harm for the prostitution thing, but my intuition is that deterring that sort of behavior comes from the perspective of the slower strategist wanting, or not wanting rather, resources to be channeled away from parenting and investment in the partner and things like that, and being channeled elsewhere. So that's the harm that someone might be perceiving.
But that argument applies to anything that the person is spending money on that's not, right? So then you should have objections to anything where the person is spending money that's not on the partner or the kids, right? So why does that make, let's be super clear. So the objection to prostitution is specifically the objection, it's not the objection, so like, it's not the objection to, it's not the same objection to cheating. Like your story, I think, would have the same, well, let me put it this way. Here's what we know. Like we know that if I do the same, if I give subjects the same scenario, but the exchange is not made explicit, people don't morally condemn it. So imagine the scenario that you have in mind. So a person is, I take it you're envisioning a married person who patronizes a prostitute. So people really don't like that. But people find it less objectionable if the same thing happens, a person spends money for the woman and then has sex with her, but they haven't made it explicit that's an exchange.
Sorry, you say they still moralize?
No, I'm saying if it's the
If
weird.
you're in a movie and not a prostitute, it
Yeah.
doesn't seem as bad to people, even though the exchange of resources and the sex act are the same.
Like exactly. So a resource account doesn't handle that distinction. So the thing that's super weird about prostitution, at least in our data, is that the secret sauce to making it bad is making it explicit. Like you can keep everything else constant, and people are like, oh, that's fine. If you add the explicitness, people are like, oh, no, that's not
Well,
cool.
because when you add the explicitness, that's when it becomes clear that this is a short-term strategy.
No, well, I mean, look, I encourage you to do the empirics on this. Tell people, because we have, and if it's clear that it's a short term and it's implicit, people are cool with that. Like that's actually, and your intuitions are saying that too, right? Like right? Short-term mating is fine. Short-term mating in explicit exchange for money is not. And we keep getting, I don't know. Like I find prostitution super weird. I find it like you just add this one little secret ingredient and then anyway, yeah.
So I know in the past you've taken exception to criticisms of what evolutionary psychologists think, that is taking as homogeneous what is in fact a heterogeneous set of theories, right? And I think to a certain extent the same critique could be leveled at you're sophisticated about this, so perhaps you've simply abbreviated your description.
The deterrence view. I think I could persuade. Oh, sorry.
The cultural evolution view is
Oh.
where I'm going with this. So you're presenting the cultural evolution view as if dual inheritance theory predicts that harm should be importance and thus that deterrence should be the principal function of the moral system, right? But there is at least one other version, right? Which is that cultural evolution favors systems which enforce norms that are group beneficial, of which harm is only one category. And
Hold on, just to be super clear, in that sentence you use the word group beneficial. And I just want to be clear, are you committed to that view?
this is one of the
Fine.
principal.
Okay, fine. Because I win that fight. I win that fight because as soon as you get to group beneficial, then you're committed to all sorts of stuff.
No, because there can be, and this again speaks to questions of optimality, where you can have a wide variety of norms, many of which enhance coordination and cooperation within the group, and some of which have arbitrary content in fulfilling that end, right? So, we all have to be Sneetches with stars or whatever it is, and we moralize that because doing so facilitates coordinating among individuals who share the same set of norms, right? But there isn't any harm in not having a star or in having a star or whatever it is. So there can be there can be a selective pressure in the context of the individual evolved psychology always operates in the arena of a cultural context in which norms have moral valence. Some of those norms involve harm, and many of them do not. So, I mean, I've always been skeptical of the notion that morality is a discrete domain, and that, you know, if you are going to, you know, carve nature at the joints here, morality is one of the wings or the thighs or something that you get. On the other hand, the notion that people care about the standards for behavior in their society, and they're upset when those standards are violated. And there's simply a wide spectrum as to how upset they are for a given norm, not a spectrum across individuals, but a spectrum across norms. Right? Then morality doesn't fall out as a natural part of the system. There is a moral psychology, but it's not because there's morality. It's that there's an advantage to the individual of successfully navigating a cultural arena.
Well, there was a lot there. I'm not sure exactly how to respond. So one thing I would say is that if you know, nowhere in my presentation did I use the words cultural evolution or dual inheritance. I wanted to make a claim, and this speaks to Clark's point. I want to make a claim narrowly about, you know, what I take to be an explanation for moral judgment in the literature that is committed to a deterrence style view. That's a separate question from whether or not I attribute a deterrence style view to different people who work in the cultural evolution field. So that's the first thing I would say. The next thing I would say is that, and that's why I stopped you, is that, you know, once you think that part of the work that morality is doing has to do with social welfare improvements, which is a style of a deterrence view. What you're doing is you're either facilitating welfare enhancing things or you're deterring welfare destroying things. It seems to me that account has to at least give an account, and maybe complexity is one answer, of why are there all these social welfare destroying norms that persist over time? And I think that's a tough question. Let me give you a counterexample. So like, I keep thinking I shouldn't give this example here either. What's the thing where you have to soak your corn before you make a tortilla? Like that's a thing, right? And
It's called water.
But there's a case where there's an actual consequence at stake, which is
lime. You have to mix lime in with the tortilla.
Whatever it is. But that, I think, when we're talking about this stuff, I've just decided that I think what I want to do is I want to talk about the way these things work, because that really is the quintessential consequentialist system, where what you want to happen is for culture to push the procedures in a way that gets you the results you want, which is to detoxify the corn.
Makes it nutritionally available.
Fine. Never. And so it seems to me that's sort of what you expect. If you have a goal state in mind, and let's just call it detoxify the corn, even though that's wrong, then if your theory about what culture is doing is it pushes in that direction, you'd expect it to work in a kind of a way that does that it brings about that consequence, the detoxification or whatever. And that, you know, there very well might be weird stuff going on along with it, but that should be the effect of it. So similarly, if you think that what these cultural norms are doing is it's, you know, enhancing, bringing about social welfare improvements, by and large, the stuff that you see that's doing that's what it should look like, and you should be surprised.
Right, but this is where the arguments part ways somewhat, which is the position that and here I'm actively advocating it. I'm not simply representing another position that's out there. With the question of dumbfounding, for example, I'm simply representing another position. Is that that a whole lot of group functional ends are achieved through homogenizing behavior across members of a group so that coordination can be facilitated.
Right, in some sense that is my argument, right? So that's a coordination argument, yeah.
Right, well, but I know, but they're different coordination arguments, because your argument is about the individuals coordinating with other punishers, and my argument is about coordinating behavior in general.
Oh, yeah, no, I take that point.
So, so we can moralize the speed with which you walk or the way that you tie your shoelaces. There's a right way and a wrong way to do it. And people will think better of you if you do it the right way, even if it's equally efficacious to do it the wrong way. even though on the face of it, there doesn't seem to be any group beneficial outcome there, the way that there is with adding line to the maze, right? But in fact, there is, because by making behavior predictable across the board, you facilitate coordination among the members of the group.
Maybe, I don't know. Like, is it literally, like, is it true that if we all tie our shoelaces the same way, that there's other domains in which we're going to coordinate better? Like, is that true?
It is true if it is reflecting the psychology of an individual who attends carefully.
If
to
it's
the
reflecting,
behavior of
is it
others.
causing? Like, I don't care if it's reflecting. Is it causing?
It is, I mean, when I say reflecting, it is indicative of the kind of person you are dealing with and the depth of their knowledge of the cultural norms and their motivation
Yeah.
to adhere to them, right? So it is a shibboleth, if you will, in many ways, right? It's really hard to know all those things and fake it, right? Or to, you know, to try and achieve some without following others
But-
when you don't know what people are judging at any one time.
Meh. I mean, you know, I guess, I mean, I have a lot, I mean, you know my reactions to these kinds of things. Like, again, if it's not cause, the other thing is that, you know, if I'm tying my shoelaces the wrong way in virtue of the fact that I don't have the right shibboleth, you actually don't want to punish me for that, because then you're punishing me, you're going to convert me to a behavior that's not going to be signal preserving, right? So like if I can, like that I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm a huge advocate in general of the notion that coordination, like money is a way to coordinate, right? This is the way that we can coordinate our, so I'm a big fan of this style of argument. I'm not a big fan of this piece of it, that I care much, that there's some actual tangible benefits of suppressing people into homogeneity in virtue of its signaling effect. Like, and besides, people should want, there should be no incentive to diverge in that case. That's the whole point of a coordination norm, right? So like, if it's good for me to signal whatever it is that I'm trying to reflect, then I really should tie my shoelaces in that way. And by the way, you shouldn't have to punish me for it, for not doing it.
So it depends what you mean by punish. If what we're I don't want to.
Yeah, I feel like this is,
Yeah,
we're gonna have this conversation for the next 15 years.
Yeah. As we have for the last.
As we have for the last.
I think we have time for one more quick question if there's.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted
Oh.
your brief story. Sorry.
I actually was intending David, but am I going to see you David later?
I'm not going to see you tonight, so we'll get a chance to.
Would you mind if I gave David the floor?
So yeah, I was just wondering what your story was about the weird Deter case and how that fits in with the coordination story.
So what we're saying is, it's easier for me to convince you about what the CEO is up to in the case in which he had this belief and it was founded on something very justifiable. It's very easy for me to convince other people in these normal, everyday, justified cases. And so it has to do with the facility with which I can make an argument that will facilitate coordination. And so it's just harder in these other cases. And that's the same argument that we have in omission cases. Gettiers is a little bit like an omission case in that sense. It's just more difficult to coordinate. But when I can point to, here's the reason, and this is what he did, and he knew the reason, then you're like, oh yeah, that was bad. Where if it's this weird case, then it's bad. Oh, I just heard an alarm go off. And I'll be here for another minute. Anyway, thank you again for that.
All right, we have to end there. Thank you.